History or Harm? Reevaluating the role of Confederate monuments in public spaces by Connor Raymond. First, connection to stimulus. I connected the stimulus in two main ways. False nostalgia. In false nostalgia, there was a study conducted on school children returning from summer break. They were asked to create a list of the good and bad things that happened to them throughout the break. The lists were fairly similar in length. 3 months later, they were asked the same thing, and then again at the end of the year. By the end of the year, the list of good things was severely outweighing the list of bad things. I will come back to this later on in my presentation, but it's important to note that this was a major part of my research. Next, I used Of Memory in Our Democracy by Colin Powell. He says, "Our monuments and memorials tell us a great deal about America's commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, even though he's not referring to directly Confederate monuments, he is saying American monuments in general should have a positive impact on American citizens. And I use this in my counter-argument, saying that Confederate monuments do not represent these beliefs. My research question is, are Confederate monuments necessary for educating future generations, or do they misrepresent history? What are Confederate monuments? Confederate monuments are any memorials or structures that commemorate Confederate leaders or the Confederate States of America. They were built primarily in the 19th century or the early 20th century. My first claim is that Confederate monuments distort history. They do this in three main ways. First of all, historical records. Gary Young, British journalist known for his work in racial issues, says, "To claim these statues represent history does not merely misrepresent the role of statues, it misunderstands history and their place in it." He is saying that monuments are not accurate representations of what has happened in our country's past. And even though it has parts of history, it is not used to understand their entire place in our history. Next, selective history. Going back to the study from false nostalgia, those students had a selective artificial version of history, much like we do today. Our memory can be skewed, whether positive or negative, based over time. So when originally we might have believed one thing, those monuments may have changed their beliefs later on. Next, influence on public memory. Ryan Best, known for his visual representations of history, says, "An overwhelming majority of Confederate memorials weren't erected in the years directly following the Civil War. Instead, most were put up decades later." Now, this means that they were not built as memory of what has happened. Instead, they were built as reminders of racial authority over African American citizens. They were built during the Jim Crow era primarily, which was a time of higher racial tension than there was right after the Civil War. Next, the ethical concerns behind Confederate monuments. Robert E. Lee himself, Confederate general, says that Confederate monuments keep the sores of war open. Now this means that it would keep people concerned or thinking about the past, and in reality it should be put behind. Now Alfred Archer, professor of philosophy at Tilburg University, believes that it's important to assess who's being publicly honored. He says this because he does not want to honor someone who he does not know the entire backstory of. Now this is important because our leaders, we do not know, Confederate monuments do not provide enough context to know what they did or have done in the past. And this leads to possible misinterpretations of people thinking that the monuments are of heroes rather than people of supporting racial beliefs. Finally, modern day impacts. First of all, lasting impact. Makoto Hunter, teaching assistant in history at UC Santa Barbara, says, although Confederate markers ostensibly memorialize the past, they inflict racialized harm in the present. This means that their presence is harmful to people today as they continue in marginalized communities. And even though they were harmful back then, people walking by these monuments every morning can harm their entire day. Next, Mitch Landrieu, a politician, says, their existence is offensive to me as a human being. The monuments to the Confederacy on our public lands are disrespectful at best. What he means by this is there is a personal connection to these monuments, and he is emotionally harmed personally. It's not just an idea that he is pointing out. Finally, setting the stage. These monuments set the stage for racism to happen. If communities are tolerating these monuments to be present on their public lands, people would infer that racism is tolerated also. So people might continue racist beliefs. Now, some people believe Confederate monuments are educational. For example, Colin Powell, author of Memory in Our Democracy, former Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, says,
They can teach us about the ideas that unite us in our diversity, the values that sustain us in times of trial, and dreams that inspire generation after generation of ordinary Americans to perform extraordinary acts of service. He's pointing out that not just Confederate monuments, but monuments in general, should positively benefit people to want to go take action. However, these monuments do the opposite. They make people remember the past in a negative way. Rebuttal the counterclaim. Johann Norberg, author of False Nostalgia, says, they tap into a powerful sentiment, a widespread yearning for the good old days. We've heard terms like the good old days, or back when life was good. They were referring to this by saying that times were better back then, and these monuments just bring back times. However, this quote is not specifically about monuments, but just in general, history. People look back on the history better than it really was. So these monuments make people think that history was better, when in reality, it was very painful to some people. Solutions. These are the two solutions I thought of. First of all, museums. Museums provide a closed and informational space to teach about what has happened in the past. Monuments, the little plaques, do not provide enough context about who the person is or what has happened to them. Next, education. Educational programs make sure people voluntarily learn about the past so they don't misunderstand what is happening. Now, both of these solutions prevent people from making assumptions and they provide a full context of what has happened in the past. And here's my work statement.